It is my pleasure now to introduce the next moderator. Jamie Jackson is a partner at K&L Gates, Washington, D.C. office. She's a member of the Public Policy and Law Practice Group and focuses her practice on national security, emerging technologies, and congressional investigation matters. Jamie has previously held senior positions both in the legislative and executive branches of government. Most recently, she served as senior counsel to former U.S. Majority Leader Steny Hoyer. Prior to this, she served as security clearance counsel for the Biden White House and deputy general counsel and staff lead for oversight and investigations for the House Armed Services Committee. I don't know what those are, but they sound really cool, and I'm sure she's got great stories. Grab her. Jamie advised Chairman Adam Smith on matters related to the passage of the annual National Defense Authorization Act. She also crafted bipartisan legislation on cybersecurity, AI, acquisition policy, supply chain security, and CFIUS, and along with military justice matters. Please join me in welcoming your next moderator, Jamie Jackson.
Thank you. And before I get started, I promise I'm not responsible for the bad legislation and regulations that you all were criticizing just a few minutes ago. Maybe some of it, but just joking. Thank you all. I know it's been a long day, but an informative day in discussion. And we have another exciting panel, and I'm really looking forward to the dialogue today. And I'm thrilled to introduce our experts that have a range of experience in the export control space. So first, I'm excited to introduce Nelson Dong. Nelson is an Counsel in Dorsey and Whitney Seattle office and serves as co-head of its national security law practice. He advises companies, universities, and research organizations on export controls, economic sanctions, national security, international trade, and investment matters. He's also a distinguished author and teacher on international technology law issues and has served as an adjunct professor at Seattle University Law School. Previously, he practiced law in Silicon Valley, serving the global semiconductor industry. He was also a White House fellow and a senior U.S. DOJ official responsible for international and national security matters and was a federal prosecutor. And he's also served as an export control policy advisor at the U.S. Commerce Department. Next, we have Adam Lysenko. He's a director for intelligence at Strider Technologies, which is a provider of technology and intelligence solutions to mitigate IP theft and supply chain vulnerabilities. His areas of expertise include China inbound and outbound investments, and he's been featured prominently in media, including The Economist, NPR, The Wall Street Journal, The Financial Times, and other publications on these topics. Previously, he was an associate director with the Rhodium Group, specializing in novel, data-driven approaches to assessing China's international investment flows. He also previously spent years in the buy-side institutional asset management roles overseeing fixed income and alternative asset portfolios. Next, we have Jungmin Pak. He's a partner in the banking and finance practice group at Lysenko, and he's come all the way from Seoul for this discussion today. This is one of Korea's premier full-service law firms. He's represented numerous Korean companies and financial institutions on potential risk associated with economic sanctions programs and export controls enforced by the U.S., UN, and the EU. He's also advised clients on energy, infrastructure, and real estate development projects related to financing and international developments. And prior to joining Lysenko, he served in the Korean Army as a judge advocate officer. And last but certainly not least, we have Carol Anderson. She's a senior corporate counsel for international trade and policy with Microsoft's corporate, external, and legal affairs team. She leads the supply chain security and customs practice, focusing on national security and industrial policy, semiconductor strategy, and supply chain and customs compliance. She has decades of experience in the technology and communications sector, including over 22 years at AT&T managing external and regulatory affairs, global business services, and government contracts. She serves on the board of the Women's Foreign Policy Group and on the executive board for the National Association of Women Lawyers. So as you can see, we have an expert panel, and let's give a warm welcome for our panel. So each of our experts is going to cover a different portion of the discussion today. First, we'll start with Nelson, who's going to give an overview of U.S. export control policies. And then next, Adam's going to provide the strategic rationale for updated export controls, as well as touch on the challenges presented by China and other actors. Jungmin's going to give an overview of ROC's export control regime and the impact of U.S. measures. And Carol's going to take us home by discussing the impact of export control on the private sector. We'll have a series of questions that I will moderate, and then we'll open it up to you all for your important questions. And so, Nelson, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
It's great to be here today. Thank you to NBR for the invitation to come and speak. Since I'm opening up this session, I will call this the ABCs of export control. ABC stands for anywhere but China. So take that lesson from this talk. U.S. export controls primarily come in three flavors. There are economic sanctions administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the Treasury Department. There are munitions controls under the International Traffic in Arms Regulations at the State Department. And last but certainly not least, the Export Administration Regulations administered by the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Commerce Department. This panel will focus mostly on the rules of the third set, the BIS rules under the EAR, or as practitioners say, the EAR. The EAR consists of a long laundry list of control technologies summarized in something called the Commerce Control List, which is divided into 10 categories, 0 through 9. I've never had it explained to me why they began counting at 0, but nonetheless, there it is. Most of the categories are self-explanatory. Category 3 covers electronics, Category 4 covers computers, and that's where most of our discussion today will focus, are the controls there. In simplest terms, export controls can control the flow of certain defined goods or technologies or knowledge or software to certain defined destinations or certain defined kinds of end uses or end users. So those are the levers of policy that can be manipulated to change the export control policy of the United States to make them either more stringent or more lenient. And administrations, as they have occupied the White House, have chosen to turn, as it were, I'm almost 75 years old, so I live in an analog world, so let me use the metaphor of dials and knobs. So these dials and knobs in export control policy can be turned up or down depending on the occupant of the White House and the policy of a given administration. In this case, over the last 3 administrations, the knobs with respect to China have been turned very sharply to the right, and generally speaking, the rules have all gotten more stringent. 2 big pieces of changed policy occurred in October of 2022 and October of 2023. In October of 2022, following a foreign policy address of major significance by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in September of 2022, the United States really moved from the classical model of export controls, which was to protect national security interests of the United States and not to allow technologies that would flow out of this country that could help a military adversary. So that was the classical definition of export controls. Mr. Sullivan's speech in September of 2022 enunciated for the first time that the United States was adding an entirely different new policy rationale to export controls, namely industrial policy. This was not stated as such, but his remarks were very, very clear to anybody who reads this kind of literature that that's the direction we were headed. And so we're going to build American advantage economically and technologically and try as best we can to handicap our adversaries, most specifically including China. So in October of 2022, the government announced through the BIS a whole series of new measures. They added new controls on advanced node semiconductors, so the advanced chips that you've been reading about, the NVIDIA H100 GPU chips. They announced controls on semiconductor design and manufacturing technology. They put more restrictions on supercomputers and more on AI technology. Those rules then percolated basically for a full year. And then in October of 2023, the government strengthened and stiffened these rules, added 2 new test factors for when chips would be controlled for export to China, and added very significantly new so-called foreign direct product rules, which are aimed at third countries such as Japan, Korea, the Netherlands, to saying that if a manufacturer in Tokyo or in Amsterdam uses American technology to produce the end goods that are forbidden to China, they will themselves then become subject to U.S. Penalties if they sell those products to China. So they adopted 3 different foreign direct product rules. Adam can probably explain them, in his remarks. They're very detailed. I want to call your attention to the fact that on this table, we have an article that summarizes these. There's very technical changes, but this is a pretty Reader's Digest version of the rules that you can take home if you want. They're over there on that stand. But these new changes in October 2023 also named about a dozen specific Chinese companies to something called the Entity List. The Entity List is a special directory of approximately 2,000 companies and individuals that have been singled out now by the United States for a penalty that consists of this. If you want to buy American goods or technology or software, then the exporter has to get an export license to sell to a company on that list, even though otherwise they would be able to get the technology without any government supervision at all. In many of the entries on the entity list, the designation says they will face a policy of denial. That's a lawyerly way of saying, don't bother applying, you're wasting LaserJet ink or toner cartridge, because we're going to turn you down immediately as soon as your application arrives. And that's a very harsh penalty. ZTE and Huawei were subject to those penalties earlier, and Huawei is back on the entity list now. So these kinds of knobs that I'm talking about are what the government adjusted in October 2022 and October 2023 in an effort to cut off more flow of advanced technology to China, particularly in the AI space. Over to you.
Thank you, Nelson. You brought up a great metaphor about how government has really turned the dials up dramatically on China. And I want to focus my opening remarks here on talking about why it has felt compelled to do so. And in order to understand that, you have to get a sense of PRC government ambitions in the chip space. Semiconductors have a foundational role in sort of this evolving geostrategic competition environment. And that is key to understanding U.S. and allied regulatory dynamics in the present day. So a couple of things to point out from the PRC side first. If you look at the guidelines to promote national integrated circuit industry, a document published in 2014, the PRC lays out in black and white what its goal is in the semiconductor industry. And that goal is to establish a world-leading semiconductor industry in all areas of the integrated circuit supply chain by 2030. So not a big deal. We just want to lead absolutely everything by 2030. That's the goal. Now, as a little tongue-in-cheek, this is actually a huge goal. There's an economic interest or a series of economic interests behind this approach by the PRC. And they make actually a lot of sense. I appreciated the comment earlier about Chairman Xi sitting in his volcano. Semiconductor policy in China isn't being dictated by someone petting a cat. There are rationales behind it. China back at 2014 faced an annual trade gap measuring in the hundreds of billions of dollars for semiconductors. Demand for chips in China was way, way higher than domestic supply was able to meet. There was fear of bottlenecks, the ability of China to pursue technological advancement in other strategic areas because of a lack of access to supply-constrained chips. And then just a very rational desire to move up and down the value chain in order to capture more of the global value added in the electronics industry. There's a huge desire in China to do more than just take semiconductors produced by foreign countries, package them into an electronic, and then ship that electronic out. You get very little of the global value added by focusing on that part of the global value chain. Of course, security interests are real as well. Reliability and provenance, especially for chips that end up in defense articles and military applications, are a concern for any country that wants to be in charge of its own, strategic military equipment. And to add a little bit more color in that space, I want to point to another document, a communique that was released after the 5th plenary session in November 2021 by the Central Committee that articulated a goal to accelerate the integrated development of mechanization, informatization, and intelligentization for the PLA by 2027. Those are words that most people, even fluent speakers of English, are not going to understand. They're terms of art. Let me try and shed a little bit of light on the last two because they're particularly important. The first one, informatization, is embedding IT in all parts of the way that the PLA operates, making sure that the equipment, that management, all of the parts of operating a modern military in China rely on modern equipment. That requires semiconductors, obviously. Maybe not highly differentiated semiconductors for most of the important equipment, but creating huge demand to help power that. But perhaps more importantly for the export control discussion today is intelligentization, which is all about decision-making AI. Chairman Xi and the other leaders in China would like to make it so that the PLA has the ability to use AI at scale to make decisions in a modern conflict scenario. And that requires not just chips, but advanced chips, and lots of them, potentially. And so that gives you a sense of what's going on the China side in terms of goals. I want to just very briefly go through a quick canvas of the history of the last 5 to 10 years and how China's tried to achieve these goals. It's going to be a little bit breakneck, and I'll try and just stay shallow here because I don't want to go over time. Equity investment was a big theme. From 2014 to 2018, there was a huge outbound surge in PRC investment abroad in the chip space. A lot of successful stories can be pointed to, but so can failures. When Xinhua Uni Group tried to acquire Micron, or other firms took aim at Aixtron in Germany, or Western Digital, Lattice Semiconductor, this led to a regulatory response in the US. And ultimately, we got FIRMA and also ECRA, the Export Control Reform Act. Arguably, those were one of the biggest drivers behind those pieces of legislation were Chinese attempts to acquire foreign semiconductor expertise. In addition to equity investment, talent recruitment has been super important. We have some proprietary people flows data that show 30,000 people from top European tech firms have relocated their places of employment, if not physically back to China, at least to PRC-owned firms in the last 20 years, partly due to inducements like talent programs, financial incentives, and coordinated recruitment activities. Research collaboration has been super important as well. We have a proprietary set of academic research data that shows that there have been at least 6,600 instances of academic collaboration between employees of global multinational chip firms and about 400 PRC unique organizations in the last 20 years, including organizations that have been frequently targeted by export control regulators, Harbin Institute of Technology, National University of Defense Technology under the PLA, and so on and so forth. Espionage and trade secret theft has been a theme as well. You can just look to the news of the last several years. Many will be familiar with the indictment against Fujin Jinhua and UMC on behalf of Micron in 2018 brought by the Justice Department. More recent news from companies like ASML, Applied Materials, and NXP points to continued efforts both through personnel and through cyber espionage to acquire chip secrets from foreign firms. And then, of course, technology imports, potentially most importantly and relevant for our discussion today. It is difficult to overemphasize, to exaggerate just how dependent even legacy chip making operations in China can be on Western firms. We have a proprietary set of trade data I combed through here and was looking at just cases of global suppliers in 2023 for a Fab 7 of Huahong Grace in China that is being constructed right now. No allegations of wrongdoing or anything here. As far as I know, there's no export control relevance for these acquisitions, but I have lists here of dozens of US, European, and Japanese companies that are providing goods and services to help support this chip build out. So in summary, the era of U.S. and allied strategic competition with China is here to stay. We appear pretty committed to different methods for economic and social governance in ways that are going to not ease in any time in the near future. The U.S. and increasingly its allies perceive an interest and leverage in slowing PRC economic and strategic progress in semiconductors in the context of that geostrategic competition. They perceive levers and they perceive incentives to pulling those levers. Export controls are certainly hard and sometimes burdensome and can be ineffective, but they are part of a holistic toolkit. And that holistic toolkit hopefully includes an effective holistic technology and innovation policy in the United States, because I personally believe that we're only going to stay ahead in any sort of competition if we're able to continue to outclass in innovation. Tech will always leak eventually. And I have lots more to say, but maybe we'll stop there. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jungmin Pak. I'm from Lysenko, based in Seoul. Let me start with the observation of South Korea's recent change in trade policy. South Korea has been an export-driven economy, as you are aware, and South Korea was very keen to invite as much inbound investment from overseas as possible to boost the key infrastructure for expanding exports. So South Korea significantly benefited from international free trade. South Korea adhered to minimal export controls as required under the multilateral export control regimes. At the same time, South Korea imposed very little restrictions or screening on inbound investment. Speaking of legal frameworks, we have Foreign Trade Act and the Foreign Investment Promotion Act, legislation of export control and inbound investment screening, respectively. MOTIE, the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy, is a responsible ministry of both acts. Interestingly, both acts declare the promotion of trade and investment as one of the key purposes. Some people argue that this dual purpose creates inherent conflicts, given the shared legal authority and responsible ministry being MOTIE. So it would be fair to say that Korean government used to lean towards expanding exports while relaxing regulations and enforcement. Now things are getting changed. Multilateral trade regimes like WTO face challenges. Geopolitical tensions like technology competition between the United States and China, the war between Ukraine and Russia, the conflicts in the Middle East caused many countries to rethink about unrestricted free trade. So many nations now focus on tailored trade policies among like-minded partners. But here, South Korea faces challenges as well. South Korea companies have significant exposure to China, Russia, and Middle East, which serve as sales markets, manufacturing hubs, and natural resource suppliers. So given the disparity of advanced technology development between South Korea and the United States, South Korea faces challenges in keeping pace with the U.S. export control, regulations, and policies. And we have internal claims in Korea about how to support Korean companies losing their market share in China. So I believe it is not a matter of export control, but involves the totality of trade-related policies and the regulations. Speaking of the Korean export control regimes, it can be categorized into two components, being list-based control and catch-all control. The provision under the current Foreign Trade Act, an ultimate authority of export control, states that the list-based control is entirely based on international export control regimes. This is very important, such as Wassenaar and Austria Group. On the other hand, the catch-all control comes into play when there is a concern of potential use or conversion into conventional weapons or weapons of mass destruction. Catch-all control is triggered when red flags are identified individuals or entities of concern are involved, and specified items are destined to respective specified countries, and when notified so. When it comes to South Korea's export control against Russia, since list-based control is entirely based on the international export control regimes, South Korea couldn't utilize list-based control to address the restrictive measures targeting Russia. So in response to U.S. proposal to join the collective export control against Russia, South Korea expanded its catch-all control by imposing restrictions on specific items destined for Russia. These restrictions closely mirror those set by the United States. It's like a copy and paste, nothing additional items imposed by Korea. Another challenge is about China. South Korea now faces the challenge to join the control of advanced semiconductor-related items to China. But this is much more challenging given the legal framework in Korea. Because list-based control of Korea is only based on international export control regimes, and China's context differs from Russia in terms of whether it is responsible for the war. Catch-all control that hinges on the concerns of weapon is not the ideal tool here. And I know the concern that in the United States that China would ultimately use semiconductor for military purpose, but under the Korean legal framework, if Korea puts China in the catch-all list, then it is saying that China is a sanctioned country, so it is not a viable option. So to address these challenges, Korea Congress recently passed a bill to amend the Foreign Trade Act, which will be effective this August. The amendment introduced a broader statutory basis of list-based control, expanding its scope to encompass a joint export control initiative among like-minded countries. So we are yet to have a statutory ground of unilateral export control. However, this amendment signals a proactive stance in enhancing cooperation with other like-minded nations in export control matters. Still, given that this is list control, the triggered regardless of export destination, China will not be listed. Instead, Korea will be able to list certain semiconductor-related items in coordination with allies, including the United States, Japan, and Netherlands. Then, when it comes to the export of those items to China, Korea can apply more stringent review standard in exercising discretion. This is a similar approach that Japan took quite recently in terms of controlling semiconductor-related items.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, panelists. I'm Carol Anderson. I'm with Microsoft's Global Trade Team. You've heard from a couple of my colleagues today, so I'm rounding out the hat trick here. So as my colleagues have articulated, Microsoft is committed and determined to develop and deploy AI in a safe and responsible way. And we understand that as technology progresses, it's just as important we ensure proper controls over AI as it is to pursue its benefits. We talked about this at lunch. Microsoft has long devoted resources and personnel to developing and advancing defensive security measures designed to protect software, data, and systems against the growing threat of malicious cyber actors. These activities are vital for securing Microsoft's own networks and products, Microsoft's customers around the world, and more broadly, the U.S. information technology infrastructure. And as we've expanded our work in artificial intelligence, particularly our work with advanced generative AI models, security has become more essential. Today's highly capable AI models are built on advanced AI data centers. They require huge amounts of computing power, specialized AI chips, and sophisticated infrastructure engineering. Microsoft recognizes and appreciates the national security implications associated with advanced semiconductors and supercomputers. And as we've discussed today, we support a careful approach to controlling these items in a manner that does not stifle innovation. The Bureau of Industries and Security within Commerce has rightly identified that technologies such as specialized AI chips and sophisticated infrastructure engineering for AI data centers are critical enablers of today's capable AI models, and effective control points are needed in a comprehensive regulatory regime. Carefully tailored controls, such as the October 7th rule and the October 17th rule, and the BIS proposed rule implementing the infrastructure as a service executive order which proposes know your customer requirements and cybersecurity controls with critical carve-outs for infrastructure as a service providers and their foreign resellers that have in place certain minimum cybersecurity best practices are sensible security frameworks that are tailored to mitigate security risk and enable innovation. Microsoft supports the imposition of these cybersecurity best practices and the traditional know your customer rules for access to advanced data centers. So moving to how the export controls impact Microsoft's operations. As you might expect, Microsoft has a very robust legal, trade, and operational compliance program to comply with the export controls which have been outlined here today. Practically speaking, leading up to the October 17th rule, we were closely monitoring the developments to understand how the October 7th rule from 2022 might expand. And we were looking and working closely with our business partners to understand the nature of technology that was used in our semiconductors so that we could help our business partners plan and anticipate for what might come with the October 17th rule. Once the rule was announced, we worked with our teams to analyze the performance thresholds these chips meet to determine if we need to approach the Bureau of Industry and Security and Commerce for a license or where we can leverage an existing exemption as part of our global data center investments. And now we're working with the teams to analyze the new license requirements to help the business understand the scope, likelihood of securing a license, and the timing. It's important to understand that supply chain decisions for 2027 and beyond are being made today. So predictability and understanding the timing and what is needed and what we're going to be able to do is a decision we're making now, but we're having to look off into the future a little bit to predict what might happen. The 1017 rule does not prohibit entities located in certain countries from accessing restricted chips. And so between the know your customer rules and understanding the different accesses technology and the security requirements, we support the imposition of these rules. Has this been complex to implement? Yes, it's been a little bit complex to implement, and certainly more transparency is needed in the licensing process, and particularly around the exception process. Typically, it's a deemed exception, and in this environment, it is not. So there's some clarity that we would benefit from understanding there. So one final point before we turn it back to the discussion that I wanted to address is we've talked a lot here about export controls and sanctions and measures that U.S. governments and allied governments can take, particularly focused on China. And an important consideration is also what type of retaliatory measures we might see from particularly the People's Republic of China. Over the summer, there were export control restrictions placed on gallium and germanium. In the fall, there were export control restrictions placed on graphite and graphite byproducts, and in December, on critical minerals processing technology. As governments are looking to impose additional sanctions and export control regimes, we also need to look at what the critical technologies are, whereas there is a dependency in U.S. industry and industry in like-minded countries on supplies from China, and programs like the CHIPS Act, which are investing in domestic end-to-end chips manufacturing for both advanced and mature node technology, are critical for the sustained innovation that we're all hoping for. Other areas of innovation or other areas for investment in critical supply chain technologies include critical minerals, printed circuit boards, and mature node technologies, which many industries are competing for with the expansion of electronic vehicles. And I'll stop there, but thank you.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you all for your remarks. And, before I get kind of into some specific questions, I want to take a step back and talk about the big picture. As you all may know, Secretary Raimondo visited China in August of last year, and I understand that despite increased tensions, it was a productive trip in a number of ways. But can you talk a little bit about kind of areas of understanding between the U.S. and China? What are some of the areas where there is agreement in this space? And open it up to anyone who wants to jump in.
Agreement. I mean, I would start with some of the like, for example, the export control regimes that I mentioned on gallium and germanium. Those are not necessarily the most critical minerals in the semiconductor supply chain, and there is a licensing regime that is available and accessible to entities that are looking to export those commodities from China. And so I would say one area of agreement would be that there is a need for there to be a level of commerce that exists between these two major economies. What that looks like exactly, I don't think there's a whole lot of agreement, but that there needs to be some connection seems to be an area of agreement. Maybe not in all branches of government, but.
Nelson, I think.
So this is a hopeful, wishful observation, I guess. One of the technical things that the Bureau of Industry and Security can do is place people on something called the unverified list. The unverified list are companies who are so opaque that the U.S. government cannot tell whether they're complying with U.S. export control laws or not. So historically, you could just sit on that unverified list, and the idea was exporters then sort of deal with them at some risk to themselves, but they're not banned from exporting. They're just put on notice. In these most recent changes that BIS has adopted, they have put in now for certain Chinese companies a 60-day rule. Once you're on the unverified list, if you still continue to refuse inspection by the BIS agents that are stationed in Beijing, you will be moved to the entity list automatically at the end of 60 days. That has caused, obviously, some consternation in China, and it has caused the Chinese government to think hard about whether they're going to allow particularly state-owned enterprises to be inspected in this way by BIS agents. We have observed a pattern where the state-owned enterprises are agreeing now finally to allow inspectors in from BIS in order to avoid being placed on the entity list and being chopped off from access to U.S. technology. That's kind of a grudging acknowledgement. That's not a very friendly, cooperative thing, but it is a realization that if they don't cooperate to this extent, they risk even further sanctions. And so that's kind of a quid pro quo that's been worked out, a modus vivendi, as lawyers would say, that has been satisfactory and acceptable to both governments.
That's a good point. Adam, were you going to?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of speculative thoughts. It's interesting asking a question about places where you see eye to eye in a realm where everyone seems like we're very focused on competition and outclassing, like I mentioned earlier. But I also, I feel strongly that the leaders of the Chinese system are often very pragmatic. And when there is a perception that it is in the interests of both of us to cooperate on certain issues, like Nelson just mentioned, like compliance with U.S. export controls, that it can happen. Now, again, speculatory, but looking at what's coming down the pipe, we've talked a lot today about AI and some questions about what are intended, foreseeable, and unintended and unforeseeable consequences of this new technology. I could imagine a world where the U.S. and China both having agreed that this is a foundational component of both future economies and how the world is going to operate, that we might want to come together and agree to some guardrails or boundaries just in sort of our mutual interests. I don't think that's out of the realm of the possible in the coming decade or two, but a little bit speculative.
That's a good point. So my next question is focused on both Congress and the administration. Obviously, when you look at U.S. national security and economic policy, you have your stakeholders in the administration, including the Department of Defense, Commerce, Treasury, and other national security and intelligence-related organizations. And then when you look on Capitol Hill, you have Senate Banking and House Financial Services Committees, Armed Services, and the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And as you can imagine, there's often a lot of tension about whether or not U.S. national security policies are so broad and overreaching that you're stifling economic growth, U.S. and globally. And so what would be your message? Obviously, a number of you all represent companies all over the world, but what would be your broad message to the U.S. government in terms of what direction they should be going in to make sure that U.S. national security is protected to the fullest extent, but that it's not so overreaching that economic growth is stifled? And I'll open that up to anyone.
I'll jump in first on that one. I mean, I think one critical message would be that control should be as targeted as possible on end users and uses of concern while continuing to enable beneficial uses. An example, I think that the export control rules are in many cases narrowly tailored for their intended purpose, and also to partner with our like-minded countries, the partnership with the Netherlands and Japan, for example, on some of the controls, so that there's consistency in how the rules are applied, but also it's harder to avoid them when they're worked in collaboration. Start there.
Anyone else?
Sure. Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I mean, it's a very complicated question. How do you judge competition between security and economic interests, and what is the right answer? I think that's basically what you just asked us to answer. There's been a lot of
long-winded way of asking that question.
Yeah,
yes,
that's complicated. And I'm one person. My perspective, I don't know the right policy mix, but I think it will have a couple of attributes. Second, what you said, Kara, about the surgical nature. I mean, I personally believe that, even though the sort of neoliberal story about China liberalizing both economically and socially as it was more and more integrated with the world, that isn't really in vogue anymore. I still actually am a big believer in the stabilizing nature of economic ties, period. And I think that we all benefit by continuing to engage, even with a geostrategic competitor, in ways that incentivize us to work with each other instead of blow each other up, either figuratively or literally. Mm-hmm. And so if we respond to perceived threats to our security by decoupling really broadly and really bluntly, I think it can actually be really harmful to future interests, not only certainly to China, but to us as well. So surgical. And then my other bit of advice would be to take both seriously. I feel like it's really easy. It's just like human nature to sort of latch onto a story. The economic interests are what matter. No, it's the security interests that matter. They both really matter. Mm-hmm. And I've seen evidence looking at data coming out of China and case studies that have shown me both that we can do a lot of harm to the U.S. by not considering the economic costs of these sanctions. And if we don't do anything, frankly, not all U.S. parties have been great about policing themselves in the past in terms of making good decisions about what to do in their economic interaction with China. So hopeful that we can be nuanced, which I know is difficult in the modern political climate, and surgical. I think those are two important principles.
Thank you. Go ahead, Nelson.
To follow on Adam's comment, I would focus advice to the government on the flow of people. And most people do not understand in the United States how many hundreds of thousands of Chinese students are studying in American universities. They constitute nearly half of all foreign students studying in America at this point. And they're at the peak, I guess 2 academic years ago, there were about 300,000 Chinese students in American colleges and universities. They represent an enormous part of the pipeline of human talent that we're talking about in earlier panels today. The Trump administration adopted something called the China Initiative, and it became almost a witch hunt across American campuses in which largely Chinese American professors were targeted in criminal cases. I think that's a very counterproductive policy, and I think we need to be far more surgical, to use the term that Adam did. And I'm very grateful that the Biden administration has pulled back from that and has a much more nuanced and subtle approach to protection of U.S. national security that doesn't label all Chinese in America as some sort of a national security threat. I think that's very destructive. I think it verges on racism to use a thing like that. And I think even our law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, have become much more aware of the hazards of that kind of blanket approach.
Thank you, Nelson. That's a really good point, and I'll save the congressional breakdown of that for the the next panel, but you raise a great point. The House China Select Committee, the House Education and Workforce, and some of the city committees are actively working on legislation to address quote unquote Chinese influence on university campuses. And so that is an ongoing issue of concern. But bringing it back a little bit more tailored, looking at the strategic basis of export controls, do you think that the objective of 10.7 and 1017 controls to limit overall advancement of China in broad domains that have dual use security is sound?
Yes, I think the purpose in itself is very sound. But from Korean companies' perspective, there are certain sentiments that whether the U.S. export controls achieved or are achieving their intended goals. So some people understand that the original purpose of imposing export controls against China and asking Korea to join was to prevent Korean companies from filling the vacancy left by the U.S. exporters. But some observations reveal a different reality. Chinese companies are replacing the legacy semiconductor equipment from Korean exporters. So this situation might have been stemmed from the private sector's, Korean private sector's lack of precise understanding of U.S. export controls, or it may have been the case that Korean companies had difficulties in conducting thorough due diligence about what's their technologies or softwares are coming from. But in either way, the Korean companies have some concern of being replaced by Chinese companies.
So I'm just going to ask one more question before I open it up. Are there lessons from export controls covering the semiconductor industry that can be drawn on for other emerging critical technologies? And if so, what are they?
I can jump in. I mean, I think that the regulations that we've seen with export controls are indication of how different type of controls are going to continue to expand and evolve with technology. I think one of the things that is really important is as we look at expanding controls and evolving technology is to maintain that dialogue between policymakers and the private sector to understand what these technologies are capable of and where controls can be applied strategically. I think, kind of a natural area might be is quantum evolves so that could be an area that gets some scrutiny. But I think with all of this, it's just the continuous review of parameters, the maintaining an open dialogue to ensure that policymakers understand the technology is just critical.
Nelson.
I think one observation that U.S. exporters generally were surprised at in the October 7 rules was the imposition of new rules restricting U.S. nationals, U.S. citizens in particular, from providing any support or facilitation of chip design overseas. This caused a number of American companies to recall their U.S. national personnel from plants in China and also even in third countries that were working on projects to service customers in China. Historically, the economic sanctions administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Control and the ITAR regulations administered at the State Department both covered services, but the EAR did not. It was really quite striking for practitioners in our space to read the October 7 rules and realize for the first time EAR was now being applied to services. And so that is a huge sea change, and it opens up a raft of new potential exposures for American tech workers and American tech companies in the service space. And I think that will expand into biotechnology and quantum and a number of other areas in the future. Stay tuned for more details on those.
Thank you. Well, let's open it up for questions. If you could just stand up, say your name and organization. You in the back. Yes.
Thank you. Jacob Felguiz with CSET, Center for Security and Emerging Technology. The 1017 rules this year, for the first time, also target companies based on headquarters, first time for the EAR. And I'm wondering for the compliance folks in the room in particular, what challenges have emerged in implementation of that control, or if everything's going great, that would be good to know as well. Thank you.
I feel like I'm the obvious one to answer that question. I'm not going to say everything's going great. I think I alluded in my introductory remarks that there are some challenges with, opacity, is that the right word here? It's not completely transparent how these rules are supposed to be applied and what the licensing regime will be. But I think that between the sort of clarity provided on the performance parameters that are in scope and where there are appropriate exceptions, it does provide adequate guidance to work with our different business organizations to understand kind of what the priority issues are for pursuing licenses and where we can rest a little bit more easy that business operations will continue as is. An example there would be, the carve out for commercial.
I would give a slightly different answer to the broader question that you asked, which is that Congress recently enacted, and it's now in force, a new law called the Corporate Transparency Act, or the CTA. For the first time, when entities are formed in the United States or do business in the United States, they have to reveal their ownership, and they have to reveal all the way up to the ultimate human owner. So you cannot hide behind corporate veils anymore with a BVI company or a Cayman Islands company or some other offshore entity. And so this means that for the first time, when you're doing business in the States, you're going to have to reveal that you're connected to X country or Y country or Z country. And that, I think, will feed into the headquarters rule that you're talking about, because the government will have access to records now that they didn't used to have because of the disclosures that are required.
Do we have any other questions? Just raise your hand. Wait for the mic.
Guanoli with American University. So the U.S. export controls might accelerate the China's investment effort to build their internal capacity in critical technologies. So I'm wondering about your take on the not short-term, but long-term effect of U.S. export controls on China's the technological advancement in the long term.
I can take a first crack at that. First of all, validating your observation that absolutely exercising U.S. sanctions creates incentives for other countries to develop capabilities to circumvent those. In the case of China, maybe that means developing indigenous capacity in the semiconductor realm. By the way, the same thing happens when the Chinese export control rare earths, right? The United States has an incentive to go and develop. And so I don't think there's a way to separate the imposition of export controls with the creation of those incentives. They just sort of come hand in hand. And so they need to be part of the holistic calculus when you're deciding, is our export control policy sound holistically? And that is really what I wanted to hammer home when I made my last sort of summary comment that export controls alone don't substitute for an effective holistic technology and innovation policy. Technology leaks in the end. You can put up roadblocks. Really good export controls can be really good roadblocks. But even in a highly capital-intensive, very technically difficult realm like the semiconductor one, the U.S. only has a lead of, 3 or 4 years in front of China based on, projected development. So if there is a desire to do something effectively to prevent another economy from catching you or from matching you in some technology, you can't just put up roadblocks for them. You have to invest in yourself. And, that includes everything from a really sensible immigration policy that allows, foreign students from all places to come to the United States and remain a magnet of entrepreneurial and scientific talent from everywhere around the world, to being cooperative with partners and making sure that, innovations and security measures and sanctions are coordinated. There's so many different moving pieces that have to be addressed. That's probably not a very satisfying answer, but just want to recognize the difficulty of that question.
That's a great point, Adam. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Nelson. I was just going to say, you mentioned immigration policy, but I think that shed lights on the difficulty of passing comprehensive legislation in a lot of these spaces. So, for example, the CHIPS and Science Act, monumental legislation to bolster the U.S. semiconductor production, was supposed to include a number of immigration-related provisions. And so you had to get so many committee chairmen, House and Senate on board, everyone from the Science Committee, Commerce, Foreign Affairs, and Judiciary had a say, which governs immigration policy. However, due to various conflicts, it did not make it. And so, as you can see, there are a lot of stakeholders, specifically in Congress, that have to come together to make sure all areas are covered. And Nelson, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to echo Adam's concurrence. I think your observation is quite right. There is the danger that there will be two separate technology ecosystems that will evolve, that China will have an incentive to develop its own chip industry and its own large language models and so on and so forth, and it will continue. But that tension has been implicit in the way that China's industrial policy has worked for some time. If you're in the electrical engineering field, for instance, you know that the Wi-Fi that we all use on our phones and in our laptops is a result of something called 802.11, which is an IEEE standard. But China went off on its own a decade ago and developed its own standard called WAPI. And there was a huge tension and a huge fight between China and the rest of the world about whether we were going to standardize on 802.11 or WAPI, because that was going to be the dominance of the standards. And so, in another sector of competition, if you look at the standards development organizations of the world, like ISO, like IEEE, like SAE, ASME, all of the engineering worlds that rely on standards for industrial production and design, there are huge geopolitical fights going on inside those standards development organizations today in order to achieve this kind of technological dominance. Because if you define in your technology, your national standard, as the world standard, you win. And if you let somebody else define the standard, they win. So, there's just more of that kind of fighting going on, and it's part of the world we live in.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Does anyone have? You with the tan sweater?
I'm Alex Feng. I'm formerly the president of Suzhou Industrial Technology Research Institute, and now I have my own company, a consulting firm called New Bridge. My question to the panel is, I was one of the immigrant students Nelson mentioned, came to the States 26 years ago and become an American citizen. And in my experience, both in the US, also in China, I think the most majority of people, I very much echo with Adam's comments earlier, is working with engagement, collaboration, and mutual interest within the framework of all these export control laws and all other legal framework. But Nelson also mentioned, I think one of the words that struck me the most is the knobs and dials are turned up so sharply, right, in the past few years. For most of the people in this room that working with Asia, have love with Chinese people, Chinese culture, many of us are betting our career in that direction. So as a part of the silent majority, what can we do to avoid, or at least slow down that kind of sharp transition? Maybe it was too sharp, maybe it was too late, but look look forward, what can we do as like people of the U.S., people from Asia, like together, how can we make this kind of backfire or this kind of rapid transition from happening again? That's my thought. I have many other questions, but I just want to say this one.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one response. Does anyone want to take that one?
I can try. Yeah, I think that it's going to be difficult for one person or a group of people to exert a tremendous amount of push against this sort of force in the future. And I mentioned a confluence of forces. This perception, I feel like, in both the U.S. and Chinese states and economies that there was no longer a near-term convergence of their systems of economics and social governance. I don't know what one person can do about that. I think that what we can do, while recognizing that there are maybe these big stories out there that the majority or the consensus view in each country are embracing that lead them to a point of competition, is that we can remain connected as people to other people, and we can focus on leading to good policy that includes some of the principles I mentioned earlier, like nuance and holistic treatment. In the end, this is just speaking personally. We're all humans, and I don't care where you are. I want humans in China and humans in America to have access to opportunities to thrive, to grow, and even as our two systems evolve in different directions, maybe in parallel to each other, I don't know what the future brings, but I know that I can, here and now, push for sensible policy that treats people equally, regardless of where they come from, that focuses on rule of law, on the application of rule of law in the realms of export controls and other relevant places, so that the rules ex ante are clear to all players and everyone can stay out of trouble who wants to. And so that we can, continue nurturing and keeping these seeds for a time maybe when the stories coming from these two different places aren't so different anymore. Again, not sure if that's very satisfying. It personally, it makes me sad in some ways to see how confrontational China and the United States have become. I don't love that. But given everything we can't control, maybe those are some of the things we can. I would appreciate any of their comments.
Thank you, Adam. Why don't we go ahead and give a round of applause for our distinguished panel. Thank you so much for your comments. Thank you.